Got nothing better to do on a Saturday night but to hang around with you.
I woke up and I noticed my pinky.
Terry, do you know what you're doing?
Jack, I've been unzipping myself since I was 6.
Remember those classic 80s shows? The ones that felt perfect until they just kept going? Back then, these series were part of our everyday routine, until cast shakeups and worn-out storylines started dulling what once felt special. Why didn't we notice when the magic quietly slipped away? There was a time when Happy Days was the heart of American television. It took you back to a version of the 1950s that never really existed, but somehow still felt like home. A jukebox, a leather jacket, a milkshake, and suddenly the world made sense. Richie Cunningham was the every kid. Howard and Marion were the kind of sitcom parents you wished you had. And then there was Fonzie, the Fonz, a character so iconic he turned a side role into the center of pop culture. In those early years, the show was magic. It was wholesome without being dull, funny without being mean. The laughs felt earned, and the characters were grounded even when the plots got silly. Fonzie gave the show its spark, but it was Richie and his friends who gave it its soul. You could feel the warmth under the studio lights, that rare kind of chemistry where everything just clicks. But like any show that runs too long, Happy Days started to drift. By the late 1970s, the show had gone through more than just growing pains. Richie and Ralph left, Joni and Chachi stepped forward, and suddenly, the tone shifted. It was still Happy Days, but the days did not feel quite so happy anymore. Characters aged out, stories began to recycle, and the sparkle that once made it a cultural event turned into something quieter, something more tired. The moment Fonzie jumped over a shark on water skis, a literal jump, became a metaphor for everything that followed. You could still hear the laugh track, but the laughs started to feel like habit. The show tried spin-offs, new characters, new relationships, but it was chasing something that had already passed. Fonzie became too perfect, too invincible, more myth than man. And without Richie there to ground him, that balance was gone. There were still touching moments. Marion still made you smile. Al still served up punchlines and burgers. But the feeling was different. You could sense the cast was holding on to something they knew had already peaked. And when Happy Days finally ended in 1984, it felt less like a celebration and more like a quiet closing shift at the diner. The neon still buzzed, but the crowd had long since left. Looking back, it is easy to see that the show should have bowed out earlier, maybe when Richie left, maybe even before that. But it kept going, because it was loved, because it used to be great. And that is the trap for any long-running show, the difference between staying familiar and staying relevant. Happy Days mattered. It changed the landscape. But sometimes the hardest part of telling a story is knowing when to say goodbye, especially when the audience has already whispered it before the lights go out. When Different Strokes first aired, it felt like something special. A show about two black boys adopted into a wealthy white family was not just new, it was necessary. Arnold and Willis were funny, smart, and quick-witted, and their presence alone pushed television forward. Conrad Bain's Mr. Drummond offered a calm, kind contrast, and together they made the show feel grounded, even when the premise leaned into sitcom fantasy. In those early seasons, the show had heart, and that heart made all the difference. It was never just about the jokes. It was about two brothers adjusting to a world that was not built for them, and doing it with style, courage, and punchlines that stuck. Arnold's "What You Talking About" became a national catchphrase, but behind the comedy, there was always a sense of something bigger. But then the show kept going. By the mid-1980s, Different Strokes had started to unravel. Gary Coleman was growing up, but the scripts did not grow with him. Arnold, once precocious and hilarious, became a teenager stuck in a child's role. The jokes hit softer. The magic dimmed, and what had once felt fresh started to feel like reruns even while it was airing new episodes. The show tried to compensate by adding new characters, a cousin, a housekeeper, even a baby. But none of it captured what the early seasons had. The original spark came from the contrast between the boys and their new world. but that tension faded as they settled in. Storylines got weirder, the tone became inconsistent, and real-life struggles behind the scenes started to show on screen. By the time the show moved networks for its final season, it was clear it had outlived its moment. The final episodes were a far cry from the show's prime. Willis was barely present. Arnold was no longer the center, just another teen in a house full of sitcom tropes. What once felt sharp and timely had drifted into sitcom limbo. Different strokes made its mark. It opened doors. It mattered. But instead of going out on top, it stayed too long. And in doing so, lost the clarity and cultural relevance that made it iconic in the first place. The show asked what could happen when worlds collided and people chose love over fear. But its final seasons forgot the question, and the answer faded with it. Sometimes a show makes history, and sometimes history makes it clear when the story is over. Family Ties was one of those shows that quietly found its place in the hearts of American households. On the surface, it was a sitcom about a suburban family, two liberal former hippie parents raising three kids in the conservative 1980s. But underneath the jokes was something deeper, a portrait of a generation gap that was real, raw, and relatable. Michael J. Fox's Alex P. Keaton stole the spotlight with every smirk, every Reagan quote, every buttoned-up monologue. He was the teenage Republican you could not help but root for. And somehow, that worked. From the beginning, the show had a strong core. The chemistry between Michael Gross and Meredith Baxter Birney as Stephen and Elise was believable. They felt like real parents, the kind who loved their kids, even when they did not understand them. Mallory was charming and silly, Jennifer was wise beyond her years, and Alex was the engine. Every week, the tension between his ambition and his family's ideals sparked new stories. It was heartfelt, smart, and always just a little bit surprising. But by the late 1980s, that spark started to fade. Michael J. Fox had become a star, a movie star, and the show knew it. Storylines began to center almost entirely around Alex. What was once a show about a family slowly became a show about one son. The balance was lost. Mallory and Jennifer were sidelined. The parents became background. The emotional center shifted, and not always in ways that felt earned. To try and recapture its heart, the show introduced a new character, Baby Andrew. It was a classic sitcom move. When the kids grow up, bring in a younger one. But Andrew never clicked the way the others did. He was not a character, he was a device, a symbol of the show trying to stay young. The innocence of the early seasons gave way to broader plots and punchline-heavy scripts. There were still strong episodes. Michael J. Fox never phoned it in, not once. His scenes with Elise or Stephen could still land an emotional punch, but the show's focus had narrowed and its momentum started to sag. It became a routine. Familiar, yes, but predictable. Safe. A far cry from the risk-taking tone that had once made it matter. By the time Family Ties ended in 1989, it was more of a whisper than a farewell. The final scenes were tender, especially Alex saying goodbye to his mom. But many viewers felt like they had said their goodbyes a season or two earlier, not because they stopped caring, but because the show had already stopped evolving. Family Ties was about change, political change, personal change, generational change. And ironically, it stayed just long enough to forget how to change itself. At its peak, Three's Company was the kind of show that made you laugh before the theme song even ended. It was silly, outrageous, and brilliantly timed. The premise was simple. A man living with two women, pretending to be gay so the landlord would allow it. But what it did with that premise was comedy gold. Physical gags, misunderstandings, one-liners. The whole show was a masterclass in timing. And at the center of it all was John Ritter. Ritter's performance as Jack Tripper was unmatched. He could fall, fumble, flirt, and fake his way through every scene with a kind of energy that never felt forced. Suzanne Summers as Chrissy brought a different kind of charm. Wide-eyed and clueless, sure, but never dull. Joyce DeWitt grounded the chaos as Janet, sharp and sarcastic and smarter than everyone else in the room. Together, the trio worked. They were the heart, the rhythm, the thing that made the show feel just right. But when that rhythm broke, the show started slipping. Suzanne Summers' contract dispute led to her exit, and the change was instant. New roommates came in, but the magic was gone. Cindy was awkward, Terry was fine, but none of them had the same spark with Jack that Chrissy did. It was not just about chemistry, it was about momentum. The energy shifted, the timing got clunkier, the laughter started to feel like memory instead of reaction. As cast changes piled up, so did the show's reliance on recycled gags. Jack fell over furniture, misunderstood a conversation, and ran out the door, again and again. What once felt clever started to feel stale. Characters began leaning into caricature, and the charm of the original trio faded into formula. The show kept moving forward, but without the balance that made it work in the first place. By the final seasons, the writing was on the wall. Literally. The set barely changed, but the show around it had lost its footing. Ritter still gave it everything he had, but he was carrying the weight alone. What started as a lightning-fast farce became a slow march of familiar beats, and then came Three's a Crowd, the spin-off no one really asked for. It followed Jack in a new relationship, but the magic was gone. The laughter that once echoed through the apartment walls had already moved on. Three's Company was a snapshot of a time when sitcoms were loud, bright, and full of misunderstandings that somehow made everything better. But it stayed too long. And in those final seasons, the misunderstandings stopped being funny and started feeling like denial. The party had ended, but the show kept answering the door. When ALF premiered in 1986, it was weird in the best way possible. A sarcastic alien from the planet Melmac crashes into a suburban garage, eats the family's cat, or tries to, and becomes a permanent house guest. It sounded absurd, and it was, but somehow it worked. Alf was loud, crude, and constantly in trouble, but underneath the jokes was a soft center. He was lonely, he was stuck, and somehow the audience connected with that. The Tanners, the ordinary human family who took him in, were the emotional glue. Willie, the exhausted father trying to hold it all together. Kate, the no-nonsense mom who never quite signed up for this. Lynn, the teenager rolling her eyes through it all. And Brian, the quiet youngest child who genuinely loved ALF like a friend. It was a setup made for chaos, and in the early seasons, that chaos felt fresh. ALF insulted everyone, broke every rule, and pushed every boundary, and people loved it. But as time went on, the gimmick wore thin. The same jokes started circling back. Alf breaks something. Alf hides from the neighbors. Alf almost gets caught. The stories felt smaller, the stakes flatter, and what had once felt like a fun, unexpected twist on the family sitcom formula began to feel like a chore, both for the audience and the actors. Behind the scenes, things were rough. The show was technically difficult to shoot, with elaborate puppeteering and long hours, and it showed. Cast members later admitted that the set was stressful, the tone was tense, and the magic was often just on screen. Even the performances started to feel tired, not because the actors lacked talent, but because the premise had hit its ceiling. How long can you keep an alien in the house before it starts to feel like you're hiding something from yourself? In its final season, the show struggled to evolve. Attempts at deeper storylines felt out of place, and the humor leaned harder on one-liners than character. By the time ALF was caught by the government in the final episode, yes, caught, the show just ended. No resolution, no closure, just an abrupt cut to black. It left fans confused, sad, and honestly a little frustrated. A few years later, a made-for-television movie tried to wrap things up, but by then, it was too late. The charm had faded. The alien had overstayed his welcome. Alf was bold. It was strange. And when it worked, it was one of the most original sitcoms on television. But it stayed just long enough to turn lovable chaos into background noise. And in the end, it was not the audience that stopped believing in ALF, it was the show itself. Knight Rider came roaring in like nothing else on television. A talking car, a mysterious man with perfect hair, and a theme song that sounded like the future. Michael Knight, played by David Hasselhoff, was the kind of cool that only existed in the 1980s, a lone hero with a secret identity, a leather jacket, and a sense of justice baked into every dramatic stare. And Kit, the artificially intelligent car, was more than a vehicle. He was a partner, a sidekick, and for a lot of kids, a dream come true. At its best, the show was sleek and fast. Each episode brought a new mission, a new villain, and a new moment for Kit to do something impossible. Turbo boost, ski mode, voice analysis, surveillance. The car did everything, and somehow, that never got old, at least not at first. But under all the gadgetry, the show leaned hard on its formula. Michael rolls into town. Something shady is going on. Someone does not believe him. Kit proves them wrong. Rinse, repeat. For the first 2 seasons, that formula worked. The action was tight, the characters were sharp, and the campy charm gave it an edge. But by the 3rd season, you could feel the engine starting to sputter. The technology that once felt futuristic started to feel like a crutch. Storylines got thinner, villains became forgettable, and even Kit's wit lost some of its spark. There were attempts to shake things up, new gadgets, new threats, but it all felt cosmetic. Michael's backstory, once mysterious and compelling, barely evolved. The deeper you went, the more it felt like the show was spinning its wheels. Behind the scenes, budget cuts and creative fatigue took their toll. Plots got sillier. Action scenes became less impressive. Even David Hasselhoff seemed to be phoning it in by the final stretch. The series finale, while not a disaster, was unremarkable. A quiet goodbye to a show that had once promised revolution and ended in repetition. Knight Rider should have ended when it still had momentum, when Kit still felt magical and Michael still felt necessary. Instead, it coasted into its last season like a car running on fumes. You still wanted to believe, but the illusion had worn thin. For all its flash and flare, the show never figured out how to grow, and so it stalled. Slowly, predictably. Knight Rider had style, it had impact, but it stayed just long enough for the road ahead to look more like a loop than a mission. When the A-Team burst onto screens in 1983, it was like nothing else on television. Big explosions, big personalities, and even bigger hair. The show had everything, a team of wrongly accused ex-soldiers on the run, each with a distinct personality and a special skill. Hannibal was the cigar-chomping mastermind. Face was the smooth-talking con man. B. Baracus was muscle with attitude and gold chains, and Murdoch was the wild card. Add in a black van, some homemade weapons, and a mission to help the underdog, and you had a recipe for one of the most iconic action series of the 1980s. It was loud, it was over the top, and it worked. The early seasons had an energy that felt unstoppable. Every episode was a self-contained mission, with the team helping someone in trouble, outsmarting the bad guys, and usually blowing up half the countryside in the process. You did not watch the A-Team for subtlety. You watched because you wanted the spectacle. It was escapism. It was adrenaline with a laugh track. And it was fun. But as time went on, the formula started to creak. Every episode followed the same rhythm. Someone in distress. The team shows up. BA refuses to fly. Face sweet-talks someone. Murdoch acts crazy. Hannibal loves it when a plan comes together. And somehow, everything explodes, but no one ever dies. It was charming at first, comforting even. But eventually, it started to feel like watching the same show on repeat. Even the characters, once so distinct, became caricatures of themselves. BA went from intimidating to grumpy. Face's charm started to feel like a crutch. And Hannibal's scheming, once clever, started looking like recycled plans from old scripts. Murdoch remained entertaining, but even his antics lost their edge without anything new to push against. The problem was not the cast. The actors stayed committed. The problem was the stakes. They never changed. There were no consequences. The A-Team always won, the bad guys always lost, and nothing ever truly evolved. For a while, that was fine. But eventually, audiences started to want more. Behind the scenes, it was clear the writers were struggling. They added new characters, tried different plot lines, moved the team around, but it was all surface. Deep down, the A-Team never left its original structure, and that made it hard to grow. In Season 5, the show made its biggest pivot. The team was captured and offered a deal: work for the government in exchange for their freedom. It was supposed to shake things up, add stakes, freshen the dynamic, but it felt like too little, too late. The change in tone clashed with the show's identity. The episodes grew darker, the action more serious, and the fun started to drain away. By then, the audience had already begun to drift. People still loved the idea of the A-Team, but they had stopped tuning in for the episodes. The ratings fell, the energy dipped, and in 1987, the show quietly wrapped up. No big send-off, no satisfying conclusion, just one last episode, and then silence. Looking back, the A-Team captured something powerful: a sense of justice without bureaucracy, of action without real danger. But it never learned how to pivot. It never gave its characters deeper arcs, or its world any real tension. It stayed in its lane until the road ran out. The show should have ended when the explosions still felt exciting, when Hannibal's grin still made you smile, when BA's "I pity the fool" still echoed like it meant something. Instead, it went a little too long. Long enough for even fans to wonder, how many more plans can come together before it all falls apart? It was a blast while it lasted, but it could have been a classic if it had known when to roll credits. The Loveboat was pure 1970s. Optimism poured into a champagne flute and served with a wink. It took the cruise ship fantasy and turned it into primetime television, a floating escape where romance blossomed, problems got solved in under an hour, and everyone left smiling. Each week brought a new group of guest stars, faded movie icons, up-and-coming sitcom actors, and sometimes real celebrities playing themselves. There was Captain Steubing, the wise and gentle leader; Doc, the charming womanizer; Gopher, the lovable goof; Isaac, the bartender with the best one-liners and even better dance moves; and Julie, the ever-smiling cruise director who seemed to keep the whole thing afloat. For a while, it worked beautifully. The novelty was part of the charm. It was not about cliffhangers or plot twists. It was about comfort. You knew what you were getting: 3 short stories per episode, each with just enough drama, just enough flirtation, and always a happy ending. People tuned in because it felt like vacation. You could forget your day, sink into the fantasy, and imagine what it would be like to meet someone under a Hawaiian sunset, with Isaac sliding you a drink and the theme song still playing in your head. But like all good things, it started to drift. By the early 1980s, the formula began to feel worn. The guests changed every week, but the stories rarely did. A lonely widow meets someone new. A couple hides a secret. Someone gets cold feet. Repeat. The structure became more predictable than comforting. The regular cast, once the soul of the show, started fading into the background, reduced to quick cameos in their own series. To keep things fresh, the show leaned harder into celebrity. More guest stars, bigger names, but the stories stayed the same. The magic that once came from chemistry started to look like stunt casting. Even the cruise destinations began to blur together. It felt less like travel and more like a treadmill. And as the cultural mood shifted, the Loveboat began to feel out of step. It was too sweet, too clean, too frozen in a version of romance that no longer matched the times. Newer shows were edgier, smarter, faster. The Loveboat stayed anchored to a style that no longer felt current. Behind the scenes, the cast felt it too. Some of them wanted out, others stayed, but the energy was different. Julie was written off for a time, replaced with a new cruise director who never quite connected. Gopher left and was suddenly in politics. The dynamic that had once been so warm started to feel scattered. The heart of the ship was no longer beating in sync. By the final seasons, it was clear the show had run its course. The charm had dulled. The smiles felt staged. And the episodes, once fizzy and light, began to sink under their own repetition. When the Loveboat finally docked in 1986, there was no grand farewell, just another episode, another wave, another slow fade to credits. Looking back, it is easy to see what made it special. It gave people hope. It offered a world where strangers met, healed, and moved on better than before. But it also stayed too long, long enough for that hope to start feeling hollow. The Loveboat should have ended when the breeze still felt fresh, when the stories still sparkled, when the fantasy still felt like something you could believe in. Instead, it sailed past its destination and forgot when to come ashore. Growing Pains started with one of the most reliable formulas in sitcom history. A working dad, a stay-at-home mom returning to her career, and 3 kids just messy enough to make it all believable. The Seavers felt real. Jason Seaver, played by Alan Thicke, was the kind of dad who could give advice with a smirk. Maggie, played by Joanna Kearns, was strong and warm, always juggling work and motherhood without losing her cool. Their kids, Mike, Carol, and Ben, gave the show its rhythm. Mike was the troublemaker. Carol was the brain. Ben was the goofball stuck in the middle. From the start, the show knew exactly what it wanted to be. And it worked. In the early seasons, Growing Pains had heart. The humor was clean, the stakes were small, and the lessons never felt forced. Mike got into trouble, but he learned something. Carol felt misunderstood, but someone listened. Ben, like so many little brothers in sitcoms, bounced between comic relief and real emotional beats. The episodes had that warm, low-stakes glow that made 1980s sitcoms so easy to love. You could tune in without worry, laugh without thinking, and still walk away with something a little deeper than you expected. But eventually, the show started growing in the wrong direction. By season 4, things began to change. The cast was aging out of their roles. Mike was less mischievous teen and more man-child. Carol's identity became tied to her grades and nothing else. Ben lost screen time. And in a move that seemed almost like a rite of passage for long-running sitcoms, the Seavers added a 4th child, Chrissy, born off-screen and rapidly aged into a precocious preschooler by the next season. They tried to keep the dynamic fresh, but the pacing was off. Plot lines started repeating. Mike still made mistakes, just bigger, less funny ones. Carol's storylines lost nuance. Ben became background noise. The family felt like a set of roles more than a living, changing household. And as the jokes got thinner, the show leaned harder on very special episodes. Then came Leonardo DiCaprio. In its final seasons, Growing Pains introduced Luke, a homeless teen taken in by the Seavers. Played by a young Leo, the character was charming, layered, and gave the show a needed jolt. But by then, it felt like a last-ditch effort. A new character in a show that had already lost its way. The scenes were good, but the timing was bad. The show no longer knew what it was, a family comedy, a drama, or a platform for guest stars. What had once been a lighthearted take on parenting turned into a patchwork of sitcom tropes. Romance plots came and went. College transitions dragged on. Mike's journey into adulthood felt like a stall, not growth. And worst of all, the chemistry that once defined the Seavers began to fade. The finale tried to bring it home. Jason and Maggie were downsizing. The kids were moving out. There was a soft farewell tone, hugs, nostalgia, callbacks. But it felt more like a necessary ending than an earned one. The audience had already begun to let go a season or 2 earlier. Growing Pains was never meant to be groundbreaking. It was meant to be steady, familiar, comforting. And for years it was. But it stayed just long enough to stretch its charm too thin. What started as a show about growing up ended as a show that forgot how. It should have left us while the laughter still felt easy. Charles in Charge was never trying to be a top-tier sitcom, but that is exactly what gave it its charm. A college student becomes a live-in helper for a family with 3 kids. That was it. No big concept, no sweeping theme. Just Charles, played by Scott Baio, acting as part-time babysitter, part-time big brother, and part-time problem solver. The tone was light, the lessons were clear, and the stakes were always small enough to wrap up in 22 minutes. In its own way, it filled a niche, dependable, harmless entertainment that could appeal to kids, teens, and parents all at once. The original run in 1984 lasted only one season, but it made enough of an impression to earn a second life in 1987, this time in syndication, with a whole new family, and that is where things got complicated. The Pembrokes, the first family Charles worked for, were quietly written out. The Powells moved in, and with them came new kids, a new dynamic, and a new rhythm that never fully clicked the way the original setup had. Buddy, Charles's best friend, stayed on. His goofy charm helped carry the humor, but the warmth, that was harder to recapture. The show had changed, but it never quite admitted it. The charm of the original season came from Charles adapting to family life, that balance of youth and responsibility. In the revival, that tension was mostly gone. Charles was suddenly more confident, more put together, and a lot less interesting. Episodes became interchangeable. Storylines leaned heavily on misunderstandings, mix-ups, and neatly packaged moral lessons. The Powell kids had their moments, but the chemistry never reached the warmth of the first cast. And Charles himself, once a likable everyman, became harder to define. Was he a student, a father figure, a romantic lead? The show dabbled in all three, but never committed to any. The result was a main character who felt strangely static, even as the cast around him aged and shifted. By the time the final season aired in 1990, Charles in Charge had been running for years on repetition. Guest characters came and went. Romance arcs started and vanished without resolution. The humor felt increasingly toothless. Buddy's shtick, once a highlight, began to feel worn thin. And Charles, still somehow living in the same house with no real job, had stopped evolving long ago. The show's heart was always in the right place. There were lessons about honesty, friendship, growing up, the usual sitcom fare. But instead of building on its foundation, the show just circled around it. No real growth, no real stakes, just the comfort of familiarity. The finale was unremarkable. There was no send-off, no final bow, just one last episode, and then, quietly, it ended. Charles in Charge started small, and maybe that was the point. But instead of growing into something better, it coasted on early charm until even that could not carry it anymore. It did not crash. It did not fall apart. It just faded. A show about a guy in charge who, over time, stopped really being in charge of anything at all. Which of these shows did you stick with too long, and which ones do you wish had quit while they were ahead? Tell us in the comments. Hit like if any of it brought back a memory, and subscribe so you never miss the moment when great TV turns into goodbye.